You're listening to Learning How to Live, the podcast about what happens after you wake up from the life you were told to want. I'm Quinn Stainfield-Bruce, and 6 years ago my best attempt at life had failed. Now I'm learning how to rebuild work, love, health, and self-worth, and I'm inviting you to learn alongside me. Let's get into it. Hello again, and welcome back to Season 1, Episode 2. What I wish I knew before rehab, recovery, therapy, and 12-step. So as said in the previous episode, my best attempt at life had failed, and I walked myself into rehab at 34 years old, not financially bankrupt. I had a good job, just about, and I'd made some money. In fact, it was the realization that the money wasn't going to make me happy that really brought me to my knees, because I wasn't financially bankrupt, but I was spiritually and emotionally bankrupt. Life had lost a lot of its meaning. I'm very careful to say, as they'll probably listen one day, but my children, who I love with all my heart, kept me alive for sure. But the vast majority of my life had lost its meaning. I couldn't go on the way I had been going, which was just the constant pursuit of more. I had no belief that there would be any arrival. I had no belief that there would be any arrival where I would be happy. Relationships were painful. Life was painful. Addiction was painful. And there was just no purpose to anything. And so I surrendered. I walked myself into rehab, 34 years old. I was 3 days clean when I walked in. And I think the first thing to really acknowledge is the surrender that it took to organize walking into rehab. I want this episode to be about the thing. I want to share in this episode the reality of rehab, the reality of therapy, and the reality of 12-step recovery. I want people who've chosen to listen to this to actually have a grasp of what happens and what one can expect, and to the best of my ability, the outcomes of it. But it's really important for me to try and explain like the moment, or what was required for me to surrender, this word surrender, because it was only in me giving up the fight that I could then embrace the change. I knew, let's put it this way, I knew I had an addiction problem back in 2009. I remember writing in my New Year's resolutions, I want to stop living that way. And so that means that even then I knew I had a problem. But then I didn't come into recovery till 10 years later. So that's 10 years of knowing I had a problem and thinking I could figure it all out myself. Okay. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's drugs or workaholism, sex, food, whatever. I mean, anyone will be able to relate to a situation that if they have been in a dysfunctional dynamic, if they have a dysfunctional relationship with food or technology, whatever, anything outside of us that you've been aware of for years and years, it means that you still think that you can fix it on your own. And that's what I thought. I thought no matter how bad things got, that I could fix it on my own, that somehow something would change one day, or someday I would have had enough and I'll do the right thing. But no matter what I tried, nothing ever worked. So when I made this decision to go to rehab, I had given up. Right? And it's this weird paradox, this weird juxtaposition, where it's in giving up that we win. it's in surrender that we find strength. It's in the vulnerability and the admission of fear that we find courageousness. And this pivotal moment that happened, and I'll try and be as honest about it as I can, or as graphic. I had been at a friend's house. It was another morning, probably a Friday, and I was still awake, still drinking, still doing things I shouldn't have been doing. And it was about 11 a.m., and it just dawned on me in that moment that I would rather be dead than find myself in this situation in a week's time, or ever again, quite frankly. I would rather be dead than find myself doing that anymore. It felt Kubrickian. It felt like this labyrinth that I was trapped in, this loop, this never-ending loop of the same thing over and over again. And anyone who's struggled with addiction will know what I mean. And I was just like, the reality of having to live like that was, I just couldn't do it. So I remember my wife at the time was, of course, very angry with me. And the first thing I said to her when I saw her was, I don't even want to talk about it. She'd heard all the excuses anyway over the years. And I just said, look, I'm going to go to rehab on Monday. And I found one, and I reached out to them, and I booked myself in, and I walked in. So the surrender is the first thing that was really profound, because actually in making that decision, I immediately felt relief. And this is like the first takeaway, is all my life I'd been fighting, resisting, controlling, hoping that things would change. And it was in giving up that I felt peace. It was like I finally didn't have to have the answers. It just didn't matter anymore. What I was surrendering to, or who I was surrendering to, well, I mean, that's probably for another podcast around some higher powers and spirituality. I wasn't aware of it then anyway. All I knew is that I had had enough, and whatever happened, whatever was going to happen to me, is better than carrying on doing it my way. And so I go to rehab, and it was amazing. It was probably one of the best 4 weeks of my life. And it was an okay one. It wasn't in LA. There wasn't some massive luxury place or anything. It was in London, and it was nice, I guess. I had my own room. That was nice. But it was just safe, and it was peaceful, and I just got it was one of the most amazing things was handing in all my technology. I know that not all rehabs actually do this, which is a shame in my opinion. But the first thing I did was hand in my phone, my laptop, my Apple Watch. Like, I had zero connection to the outside world. And it was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. Instantly, I was just like, okay, I only have to worry about myself right now. And then, we go into, over the course of these 4 weeks, one-on-one therapy, a lot of group therapy. But then I was introduced to all sorts of other things. I was introduced to yoga. I was introduced to meditation. I was introduced to sound baths. And if anyone's familiar with sound baths, they'll know what I mean, but it's probably one of the most beautiful things you can ever do. I highly recommend doing sound baths for anyone. But I was, there was this just very healthy food. I was, I actually they had to make me go to the shops. I think, your first week, the rules are generally you stay in, you don't leave. And then afterwards they encourage you to go out with your peers to maybe the shops or something occasionally. And I didn't want to. I actually I guess I got a bit of Stockholm syndrome. I didn't want to leave. I just felt so safe, I think, maybe for the first time in my life. And I think this is another big theme, a trend that will come up is with us is, do we feel safe? How how safe did we feel growing up? And I'm not talking necessarily from abuse or from physical threat, but if we grew up in a household where money was scarce, or where people were arguing a lot, or where people were just unhappy, or where tempers could fly, that could make us feel unsafe. It could, one of the most important things is for me and my children today is that they feel loved and they feel safe. I need them to feel safe, because if they feel safe, then they can, that's an anchor for them. Now, I never really felt safe in my life. I didn't feel safe growing up. I didn't feel safe, throughout most of my adult life. But in going into rehab, in this bubble with no technology, and, I felt safe in this building. I felt cared for. Again, really for the first time in a long time. And that was amazing. Can you imagine the pattern interrupt of going from this just despair to then into the warm embrace of this institution, and how important it was that I was just cradled in that moment, metaphorically. It was, that I was just held. And that's a lot of what safety is about. It's about being held, being seen, and being heard. And this is, again, these are common dysfunctions in today's society. This isn't just for people in recovery. How often do you really feel seen by maybe your romantic partner or your family or your colleagues or your friends? How often do you really feel heard, actually heard, your truth? And the answer generally when I speak to people, it's not that much. And I certainly hadn't been. But, over the course of this one-on-one therapy that I had in rehab and the group therapy of being with other people who were going through and feeling exactly what I was feeling, it was unbelievably therapeutic. Because even if the people there were as mad as I was in that moment, they knew exactly how I was feeling. They knew exactly what I was going through. And so I felt deeply heard and seen. And, and the therapists there were amazing. And so in those one-on-one sessions, they, again, to feel really seen. I remember one therapist saying to me something quite profound. I had spent a lot of my professional career in sales, and I guess I sold quite a lot generally over the course of 20 years, but I don't think I was ever particularly good at it. And I don't think I can pretty categorically say I didn't really enjoy it. Always felt good closing a deal, of course, but generally the process, the hunt, was not fun. The way that it was occasionally fun historically was from a place of being, I guess, manipulative, which is not how I live my life today, so it really doesn't coincide. But one therapist said to me in a one-on-one session, he said, "Quinn, you're too emotionally aware for sales." And it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was like, I like talking about feeling seen. I was just like, yeah, I think I am too. It's unbelievably painful. I'm highly sensitive. I'm way too emotionally attached, to be functional in this career. It actually played a fundamental role, because when I came out of treatment and I met my boss, who was so lovely. She was such an angel. And, I sat down with her and I said, "Look, I think I'm not going to come back." And she agreed, probably the way I was, behaving a lot of the time. It's probably a bit of a relief to the company I was at, but she was so kind, and she just wanted what was best for me. But my point is that therapist seeing me, being able to sort of land that with me, I was like, yeah, I can't do this job. This hasn't made me happy. And it actually allowed for me to think about what actually did make me happy. And for years, I hadn't thought about what made me happy. I didn't know. I thought happiness was pleasure. I thought happiness was what I could put into myself. I thought happiness was was drugs or food or sex or stuff or, you know, people's affirmation. So I'd never even contemplated what actually felt good to me, genuinely. And it made me reflect on things I loved, like, say, history or, you know, or these types of passions that I had. And so it led me to pretty much instantly after I came out of rehab to go and do a degree. I'd never done a degree. I was going to at 18, but I started my company and decided not to, which was a good thing because I would have done very little at university at 18, I suspect. But I went off and did a degree in you know, in history of East Asia and South Asia and in all of these, in religions and philosophies. And it was, for 3 years, an absolute light in my life. And again, had I not been seen and been heard and had the opportunity for someone to help me see some truth, would I have made that decision? I don't know. I honestly don't think so. So rehab was, like I said, this very beautiful space. And interestingly, by the time I came up to the end of my 4 weeks, because I was originally just going to be there for 2, and I was encouraged by a therapist there to stay for an extra 2, which, you know, initially I freaked out about because I thought, oh no, what's going to happen with work? What's going to happen? What are people going to think? But it was absolutely the best decision I ever made. But by the end of the 4 weeks, I was ready to go. Interestingly, you know, considering I didn't even, for the first couple of weeks, I didn't even want to leave the building. By the end of the 4 weeks, I was ready. I was ready to get on with life, and it was just perfect. Things that maybe I was worried about. I was worried about what people would think of me. Pride. I was worried about being some sort of, I don't know, being vilified, being made a pariah, shame, I guess, embarrassment. I was worried about all of the things going into rehab, about what people would think, how it might impact my work, you know. And the reality is, it didn't impact anything in that way. You know, I haven't heard of any examples where people have sought help for some sort of mental struggle, gone and found that help in the form of some sort of institution, and that then they've been chastised for it by work or by family or by friends. I mean, my experience was that people were generally very, very sympathetic and supportive, and they just wanted what was best for me. You know, I really had nothing to be afraid of. I guess there was a part of me, you know, most of my adult life, who knew that the buck would finally stop when I found myself in rehab. And, you know, I guess, you know, everything happens in the time it's supposed to happen. You know, if I had gone to rehab early, would it have made a difference? Would it have stuck? I don't know. But I definitely had nothing to be afraid of. It may well be the most beautiful thing that I've ever done for myself. And it was just like a spiritual well-being holiday. And I'm so grateful that I had the ability to do that. After that, I continued therapy. And therapy is something else. Yeah, it's becoming far more common now today than even 6 years ago. People are far more open to talking about it. You know, there's all sorts of online platforms and ways and means to get therapy. You can even sort of walk in off the high street to the therapist today. And again, you know, what did I think therapy meant? I only engaged with therapy when I had a problem to solve. This is a big shift. You know, that therapy is supposed to treat symptoms. But therapy is not about treating symptoms. Good therapy is about treating the cause. The cause. Symptoms of my cause. And my cause was that I felt unlovable. My cause was that I felt worthless. That was what was the cause of various behaviors of mine: anxious attachment, addiction, whatever. But I would see therapy as a treatment of the symptoms. I've got an addiction problem. Therapy can fix the addiction. I've got anxious attachment, romantic challenges. Therapy will treat them. I have an eating disorder. I have never necessarily had a formal eating disorder, but if I did, therapy might be something that you think would fix it. And that was how I saw therapy. Therapy was a way to fix the symptoms, but that's not what it is. Really good therapy is about getting to the root cause of why these things happen. Unfortunately, today, I think, I don't know, unfortunately, fortunately, who knows? Most people only seek help or pursue inner work and growth and transformation from a place of pain, right? Very rarely have I encountered people who have undergone radical transformation when everything was okay. And because of that, it means that people pursue therapy from a place of symptoms. It's like, I keep getting my heart broken. Please, therapy, fix it. I have this addiction problem. Please, therapy, fix it. When the truth is, the freedom in life comes from the ability to be self-honest. And where therapy helps us is it acts as a guide and a shining light for us to go inwards and explore our subconscious and our narratives and our core beliefs, because it's in understanding why we may be afraid or may have these feelings, these or core beliefs around worthiness or lovability. In discovering those, that we can see how they play their parts in our lives, and in healing them, we can stop the behavior. Because if you try and stop dysfunctional behavior by just treating that symptom, if you try and deal with addiction just by looking at addiction as the problem, then it will be whack-a-mole. You might be able to stop addiction for a period of time, but then it will re-manifest as dysfunctional romantic relationships. You might be able to stop being so dysfunctional in a romantic relationship, but then you'll end up, eating 12 bags of Haribo every day. You might be able to get a handle on the food, but you'll end up overspending on credit cards. It becomes this sort of game of whack-a-mole. But when one can get to the truth being that I may feel unlovable, unworthy, and when one can uncover that those narratives are not true, and when one can restore a feeling of integrity, of wholeness, when one can restore a feeling of, that I am worthy, that I am lovable, all of those other dysfunctions start to lose their power pretty aggressively. And so therapy, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I thought therapy was a symptom solver. And so the only reason I'd be in therapy is if there was a problem. But what if I didn't want to admit that there was a problem? Right? And so the barrier to therapy being that I guess it will have to get so painful before I admit that it's a problem, at which point things have got so bad and now I will crawl into therapy. When actually, if what I'm trying to do is pursue truth, if I'm trying to grow, if my stance is I want to become the best version of myself, the same way one might do when they go to the gym and exercise. You go to the gym consistently just so you can be fitter, stronger. And if that was the way I looked at it, then maybe I would have gone to therapy a lot sooner. But that's certainly the way that I look at it today, because a therapist acts as a guide, as someone who will shine a light on the dark places that we are often afraid to visit. And this is the other thing I say, is that good enough, life being good enough or life being okay, is one of the biggest criminals in in the sort of mediocrity, because we think because things are okay, we decide that we don't want to step away from the familiarity, the comfort of our campfire. We don't want to step into the darkness. We don't want to step into the unknown. We don't want to face the potential demons and dragons, because it's good enough by the campfire. It might be a bit cold, or it might be a bit damp, or I might be a bit hungry, but I'm alive here. And so I don't want to go and rock the boat, even if there might be treasure, which I don't believe there is treasure. So I'm just going to stay here. The thing is, if the campfire became very, very painful, then you would be forced to go and explore the darkness, which is what happens to most of us. It doesn't have to be that way, though. But here's the thing about venturing away from the campfire. Here's the thing about venturing into the darkness and potentially finding dragons that need to be slain, is that underneath those dragons is always treasure. Always. It's the hero's journey. It's how it works with Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or anything else. It's that we have to go on these journeys which are scary, where we have to be brave, but it's where we get to grow. And it's where there will always be a reward of some sort if we're brave enough to pursue it. And so therapy can act as a guide into that darkness, a safe pair of hands. I guess an experienced pair of hands. And so for me, surrendering to therapy was a very powerful thing. And if I, again, had known that anything that I was afraid of discovering, any problem I was afraid of fixing, would lead to the life that I have today, then I never would have given it a second thought. Again, therapy is often one of the more beautiful things we do. When it becomes uncomfortable, when therapy becomes uncomfortable, it's usually because we're having to face things that we don't want to face. It's usually we're facing things that we've suppressed for a long time. And my advice is, don't be afraid of that. When it gets uncomfortable, when you don't want to do it, when you really don't want to do it, that's when you should persevere the most, because this is when you're really starting to face the dragons. And I'm telling you, there has not been a scenario where I haven't faced painful dragons, subconscious dragons of mine, and I haven't been heavily rewarded afterwards, and in a feeling of serenity, of peace, of freedom, sometimes even in material things. It's like it's a very, very powerful and cathartic process. So, that's the rehab and the therapy. I was going to touch on 12-step recovery, but I think I'll touch on it briefly, but I think it deserves its own episode because it's so extensive. I knew I had an addiction problem going back to 2009. I knew it then, and I didn't get clean till 2019. I went to my first NA meeting, I think, in 2011, and I just did one, and I walked out afterwards and didn't go back for about 2 years. And then I went for a little bit longer, maybe 90 days, and then same thing. And then again, a few years after that, got 120 days clean, and then went back out for a couple of years. My point being is that I knew it existed, and I didn't do it. Why? And it was because, there was every excuse under the sun. A, I wasn't ready to stop. And the rule, but 12-step recovery, the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop using. And if I didn't have the desire to stop using, then it wasn't going to work out too well. But that wasn't just it. I came up with every excuse under the sun as to why 12-step recovery wasn't going to be for me. I'm not like the people there, or they're different, or they're worse, or I'm better, or, those always just wouldn't work for me, or I've tried it. And the truth is, I'd never tried it. I turned up to some meetings, but I never actually worked the 12 steps. Right? And the thing about, you can go to a meeting, a 12-step meeting, and there's a saying, going to a 12-step meeting but not doing the steps, not working the actual steps, is like checking into a 5-star hotel and sleeping in the lobby. Meetings are wonderful for many, many reasons. I'm sure I'll explain at some point. But the 12 steps, the actual 12 steps is amazing. Now, why would there be avoidance? It's a lot of work, the 12 steps, particularly in Narcotics Anonymous. But it's like, there's just many more questions, much more thorough. But there's just daunting aspects to it. Famously, step 9 is we make amends to those we have harmed. The idea of having to apologize to the people we've harmed is a daunting thing, and enough to put most people off. There's a lot of reference to God. That puts a lot of people off. It didn't really put me off. It didn't bother me too much either way. Certainly by the time I came in 2019, I was ready to do whatever I was told, and if that included believing in God, then so be it. But there's many reasons why I didn't want to do it. But like I said, the main reason was I didn't want to change, really. I didn't want to give up what I was doing until I did. And then when I did, I was willing to do whatever. And here's what I wish I'd known about 12-step recovery. I wish I'd known it's the most beautiful form of self-analysis, of self-therapy that exists. I mean, it is a blend of some of the most profound ancient human wisdom, Stoicism, Buddhism, Christianity. It's got Taoist principles. It's got Jungian approaches. I mean, even Jung was a big fan of 12-step recovery. It's a phenomenal philosophy for life. Why do people who have many, many, many years free from whatever addiction they had continue to be involved and to attend and to go to meetings? Why do I go to meetings, years after I last had a drink or did any drugs? Why am I still so involved? Because it's the most beautiful philosophy for life. Drugs were never my problem. Alcohol was never my problem. They were solutions to my problem that stopped working. My problem was not really knowing how to live, and because I'd never been shown. And 12-step recovery gives beautiful guidelines in order to how to do this. And it is becoming much more and more accepted, and people are becoming more and more aware of it. And there's a lot of books and a lot of things being spoken about 12-step recovery because it really is truly beautiful. And it asks very little. It just requires open-mindedness and willingness and the application of other spiritual principles, which is also what makes life so beautiful when we're in a place of giving rather than taking. I will dedicate an episode, maybe I'll dedicate episodes to individual steps, because there's so much that can be said about 12-step recovery. But again, all I know is it is one of the most beautiful philosophies for life, made up of thousands of years of ancient human wisdom. And it's helps millions and millions and millions of people around the world in ways that nothing else could. This is the thing, and I say this to anyone who's not an addict or who's not in recovery, or someone who's just dealing with the malaise of life. If this program of 12-step recovery can help a street-using heroin addict get clean, I was not a street-using heroin addict, by the way, but if it could help a street-using heroin addict get off the streets, get clean, get a great job, start living a full and happy life, what do you think it could do for you? Imagine just how it could tweak life that much. Anyway, we'll be sharing more on that as time goes on. So, in summary, some of the key takeaways, like what I wish I'd known about rehab and therapy and 12-step recovery. There was nothing ever to be afraid of. If you find yourself contemplating whether it's something you need to do, and you're scared of what people think or how you'll be received or what it will mean for work, don't be. You don't need to tell everybody everything, but anyone who cares about you will just be highly supportive. And whatever experience you're worried about having within rehab or therapy or recovery, again, don't be afraid. It's even when it's scary, it's beautiful. And like I said, for me, it's changed my life from being in a place of real darkness to living a life beyond my wildest dreams. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to connecting again in episode 3. Thanks for listening to Learning How to Live. If this sparked something for you, share it, subscribe, and remember, you don't have to escape your life. You can build one worth staying for.